Hello. Welcome to Lecture 6 of the Linguistic Anthropology course, developed by Language Lab. This lecture is titled Human Consciousness, Part 1. Over the next 2 sessions, we aim to provide a fresh perspective on the long-standing debate surrounding the enigma of human consciousness and the concept of the self, the subjective I, that each of us seems to possess and that appears to exercise free will. We will argue that these core features of human experience originate in our linguistic capacity, whose evolutionary roots we explored in previous lectures. The faculty of speech is the central mechanism through which we structure our experiences and respond to stimuli, forming the very foundation of the uniquely human mode of existence. Before delving into this vast and complex topic, let us briefly revisit the key conclusions from our previous sessions, which will serve as both the foundation and point of departure for our upcoming discussion. 1. As a result of encephalization during the evolution, the formation of neuronal mirror systems happened in the brain, following which early humans began to suffer from a cognitive dysfunction, the spontaneous production of mental images perceived internally. In order to stabilize their perception, they were compelled to find a method for externalizing these redundant internal images, placing them, as it were, back into the external world, where perception should originate. 2. The solution to this crisis was the emergence of symbolic thinking and language. However, this solution did not arise spontaneously, it required a confluence of highly specific circumstances. In our previous lectures, we outlined our hypothesis regarding the specific developments that took place. 3. The method involved externalizing an emotion related to a mental image through vocalization, then receiving an echo of that vocalization from another individual, allowing the regression to be perceived not as something happening within the mind, but as unfolding externally, in what might be called the mind of reality. The external reality thus acquired its own intentionality. My mind begins to exist outside of myself, and the external reality, comprising the other individual who echoes me, becomes me, outside of me. These are some of the key premises to keep in mind for today's discussion. However, before we begin constructing our theoretical model, let us first review a. the prevailing scientific theories regarding the nature of human consciousness, and b. the neurophysiological and mental states that appear to constitute consciousness, along with the cognitive capacities it seems to engender, all of which we collectively refer to as consciousness. Let us begin by posing a disturbing question. What is consciousness? The question is disturbing because consciousness is intimately tied to our sense of self, yet formulating a clear and satisfying answer remains profoundly difficult. The issue of human consciousness is a notoriously complex one. In modern empirical and theoretical science, it is approached with considerable caution. To illustrate the challenge, consider a simple thought experiment. Are you conscious at this very moment? The moment you ask yourself this question, the answer seems to be yes. But were you truly conscious just before you posed the question? As strange as it may sound, this paradox lies at the heart of the problem of consciousness, and some of the greatest thinkers in history have found the answer far from straightforward. The renowned 19th-century psychologist William James famously likened the difficulty to trying to turn up the gas quickly enough to see how the darkness looks. Susan Blackmore, a prominent scholar of consciousness, updates this metaphor for the modern age, comparing the challenge of determining one's own consciousness to opening a refrigerator door quickly enough to catch whether the light is on when the door is closed. As an initial provocation for this lecture, we invite you to reflect on this still anecdotal, yet intriguing link between language and human consciousness. Might our very awareness of self have emerged from our capacity to speak? To be able to ask ourselves using words, whether we are conscious or not, and ignite our sense of conscious self with the words, as if conjuring consciousness by a charm. Our frustration in attempting to detect a clear, internal sign of consciousness, an enduring, unified I, was already articulated in the 18th century by the Scottish philosopher David Hume. In his seminal work, A Treatise of Human Nature, 1739, Hume famously observed, "When I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other, of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception." This reflection captures Hume's skeptical view that the self, as commonly conceived, is not an observable, internal substance but a bundle of perceptions, constantly shifting and never unified in a single, stable entity. His insight remains a foundational challenge to any theory that posits a fixed, introspectively accessible self at the core of consciousness. As we will see in the sections that follow, this view has been revisited and elaborated by many contemporary scientists and philosophers who similarly challenge the notion of a stable, introspectively accessible self. From Daniel Dennett's concept of the center of narrative gravity to Antonio Damasio's embodied model of the self, modern theories increasingly support the idea that what we call the I is not a fixed inner entity, but a dynamic construction emerging from complex cognitive, emotional, and physiological processes. However, opponents of this view consistently raise two major objections, both of which appear compelling from the standpoint of introspection. The first is the notion of the bounded self, the persistent and seemingly unified sense of being a distinct individual, separate from the external world and continuous across time. This subjective unity challenges theories that reduce consciousness to a mere aggregation of dynamic, distributed processes. The second objection concerns the unique and irreducible quality of subjective experience, commonly referred to in the philosophy of mind as qualia. Qualia are best understood as the intrinsic, ineffable aspects of our experiences, what it feels like to see the color red, taste bitterness, or hear a violin play. These qualitative properties of consciousness resist explanation in terms of purely functional or computational processes. Neither the concept of the bounded self, nor the phenomenon of qualia, can be easily accommodated within theoretical frameworks that conceive of consciousness as an emergent property arising from a random composite of dynamic subsystems. This difficulty is crystallized in the famous so-called hard problem of consciousness, as formulated by philosopher David Chalmers. How and why does subjective experience arise from physical processes in the brain? Current models offer no satisfactory resolution to this fundamental question. Among the disciplines that address human consciousness, philosophy holds the broadest license to formulate foundational questions and offer speculative frameworks. We will therefore begin with the historical views of philosophers concerned with the nature of consciousness. The first major divergence in philosophical approaches to consciousness is the long-standing divide between idealism and materialism. Over time, this dichotomy evolved into the more modern distinction between dualism and monism, largely shedding its explicitly religious associations. Idealism holds that reality is fundamentally mental or spiritual, and that matter has no independent existence. In its radical subjective form, as in Berkeley's philosophy, the claim is that matter does not exist at all. What we call the world is only a collection of perceptions, and to exist means simply to be perceived. In its objective form, as in Hegel, matter is not denied but is understood as dependent on mind. The material world is an expression or manifestation of spirit. Materialism holds that reality is fundamentally physical, and that everything that exists can be explained in terms of matter and its interactions. Mental phenomena, such as thought and consciousness, are not independent substances but arise from, or reduce to, physical processes, typically those of the brain and nervous system. On this view, there is no need to posit immaterial entities or principles, since all aspects of reality are ultimately grounded in the material world. This view has developed especially rapidly since the 17th century, fueled by the rise of scientific discoveries, technological innovations, and social transformations such as the decline of religious authority and the emergence of new forms of intellectual freedom. Dualism claims that reality consists of two independent kinds of substance or principle, the mental and the physical. The mental is understood as immaterial, spiritual, or connected to consciousness and the soul, while the physical is material, extended, and bodily. Neither can be reduced to the other, and both are regarded as equally real. The central difficulty for dualism lies in explaining how these two distinct realms interact, as in Descartes' view that the soul and the body causally influence one another while remaining separate. This tradition is continued today by philosophers such as Noam Chomsky, Thomas Nagel, John Searle, David Chalmers, and others. These thinkers maintain that the two primary components of reality, mind and matter, are fundamentally distinct and incompatible, and that human consciousness cannot be fully explained in material terms. On the other side, materialist philosophers, many of whom now prefer to be identified as cognitive philosophers, continue to argue that there is no fundamental distinction between mind and matter. In their view, the workings of the human mind and consciousness can and should be explained entirely in terms of physical processes and natural laws, particularly those uncovered by neuroscience, cognitive science, and computational theory. Philosophers commonly associated with this materialist cognitivist position include Daniel Dennett, Patricia Churchland, Paul Churchland, Jerry Fodor, and others. These thinkers maintain that mental phenomena such as thought, perception, and consciousness emerge from, and are ultimately reducible to, the activity of the brain and the laws of the physical world. Monism itself includes two contrasting perspectives: materialist monism, which we have just described in its modern incarnation as grounded in neuroscience and cognitive science, and idealist monism, which posits that only mind or consciousness truly exists, with the material world being a projection or construct of that consciousness. Philosophers who hold this view are intellectual descendants of earlier religious and metaphysical traditions, such as Bishop George Berkeley's idealism. For these thinkers, consciousness creates the very perceptions we interpret as signs of an external, material world, when in fact, that world may have no existence apart from consciousness itself. Modern idealism manifests in a variety of forms within contemporary scientific discourse. Philosophers have long aspired to reconcile the two fundamental components of human existence, mind and matter, within a single, harmonious theory. Yet such attempts have consistently fallen short. These efforts persist because both dualist and monist positions, taken independently, encounter profound and arguably irresolvable difficulties. Dualists struggle with the question of interaction. If the mind is truly separate from matter, how can it operate within the physical world and exert influence on it? If such interaction occurs, then at least some point of overlap between the two substances must exist, implying that they are not entirely distinct after all. This undermines the very premise of dualism.
But mind and matter may communicate through the pineal gland.
Materialist monists, on the other hand, face the reverse challenge. While they affirm that everything, including the mind, is material, they have yet to fully explain the mechanisms by which subjective experience arises from brain activity. The richness of internal experience, our thoughts, emotions, and sense of self, remains elusive under a purely physicalist framework. How and why such experiences emerge from neural processes is still deeply mysterious.
Don't worry. I'm sure one day science will explain it.
Idealist monists arguably hold the most convenient position. By claiming that only mind or consciousness exists, and that the material world is a projection or construct of the mind, they avoid the burden of empirical explanation altogether. However, this position is typically regarded as unfalsifiable in scientific terms, that is, it cannot be tested or disproven by empirical means, and for that reason, it is generally considered outside the bounds of scientific inquiry.
My soul? Unfalsifiable? But this is exactly right.
Complicated, isn't it? The philosophical distinctions outlined above do little to advance our understanding of what consciousness is or how it is structured. They are primarily concerned with the question of whether consciousness has a physical or metaphysical nature. Let us set these debates aside for now. Instead, let us now turn to scientific approaches grounded in empirical evidence, which aim to illuminate the nature of consciousness itself. First of all, let us remind the audience of a well-established fact in contemporary neuroscience. There is no single governing center in the brain that can be identified as the mind. Extensive scientific research has found no centralized cockpit, command center, flight control room, or any other metaphorical location where a decision-making self might reside in an all-seeing, all-knowing position. In reality, the brain is an extraordinarily complex and densely interconnected neuronal system, structured around continuous feedback loops among hundreds of millions of neuronal circuits and their subcomponents. These circuits form and dissolve opportunistically, as the brain's overall configuration exhibits remarkable plasticity. Even the more recently evolved, characteristically human regions, such as the frontal cortex, responsible for functions like emotional regulation, reasoning, judgment, and social interaction, are deeply enmeshed in an immense network of signal exchange with the rest of the brain. Their functioning is so dependent on interactions with other regions that it is impossible to assign to them a dominant or sovereign role, or call them the center of human consciousness. Thus, what we experience as the mind or the self, our unique internal subjectivity, emerges from the dynamic interaction of numerous brain systems. These systems are constantly processing and evaluating multiple streams of information, both from external stimuli and internal states, whether consciously perceived or not, and continuously generating appropriate responses. Given all of the above, what then do contemporary philosophers and scientists propose as a plausible definition of consciousness? Let us examine some of the most influential theories. 1. Good old dualism. One of the classical views is substance dualism, as proposed by philosopher Karl Popper and neuroscientist Sir John Eccles in their 1970 work. According to this perspective, the non-physical, self-conscious mind is distinct from the unconscious, physical brain, and can influence it through subtle interactions, possibly at the level of synapses. Eccles specifically suggested that the mind could exert causal influence by modulating the probability of neurotransmitter release at synaptic junctions, thus subtly guiding neural activity without violating physical laws.
Aha! What did I tell you? If not through the pineal gland, there is still a way for mind and matter to communicate.
Another influential view is property dualism, advocated by an Australian philosopher of mind and cognitive scientist, David Chalmers. In this framework, the universe consists of only one kind of substance, but this substance possesses both physical and mental properties, depending on the perspective from which it is observed. These are just two of many modern dualistic theories. They are appealing in part because they are unfalsifiable, and for the very same reason, they remain deeply problematic from a scientific standpoint. 2. Higher-order thought theories. A significant group of theories within the philosophy of consciousness falls under the umbrella of higher-order thought theories. These theories, broadly speaking, propose that human perception operates on two distinct levels, a lower order and a higher order. According to these accounts, consciousness arises when a lower-order mental state is itself the object of a higher-order mental state. As Rocco Gennaro, an American philosopher whose research focuses on the philosophy of mind and consciousness, succinctly puts it. In general, the idea is that what makes a mental state conscious is that it is the object of some kind of higher-order representation. While there are several variations of hot theories, a central critique applies to them all. They remain primarily within the realm of philosophical modeling and do not provide a clear, empirically grounded account of what precisely constitutes a higher order versus a lower order mental state. The nature of this division, its mechanisms, and the reason for this dual-level structure in human cognition remain largely speculative. Intuitively, it seems plausible that we become conscious of an action when our attention is directed not merely at the action itself, but at the fact that we are performing it, suggesting a kind of internal self-monitoring. However, the origins and nature of this reflective awareness are not well understood, nor is it clear why such a structure would evolve, or how it is implemented in the mind. Beyond this foundational issue, hot theories face several technical challenges. For instance, as noted by Suzanne Blackmore, a British psychologist known for her work on consciousness, these theories struggle to account for certain altered states of consciousness, such as deep meditation, where individuals report being vividly conscious, despite the apparent absence of any thought at all. Of particular interest for us is the higher-order thought theory, proposed by prominent neuroscientist Edmund Rolls, which he refers to as the higher-order, syntactic thought theory of consciousness. In this model, the higher-order mental state responsible for consciousness is instantiated by a specialized syntactic mental module, a system capable of generating structured, language-like representations about other mental states. Although the precise neurological substrate of this higher-order module remains uncertain, the theory once again underscores a recurring theme, that language plays a central role in the emergence of consciousness. 3. Dennett's theory. Daniel Dennett is a highly influential philosopher of consciousness, and his views merit careful consideration in any comprehensive review. Dennett rejects the notion of a continuous, unified stream of consciousness, or a substantive self. According to him, there is no single time or place in the brain where everything comes together and becomes conscious. Instead, the brain functions as a parallel, distributed processing system, without a central command center, and without a fixed I. Dennett argues that the self is not an internal entity, but rather a useful abstraction, what he calls a center of narrative gravity. Much like the center of gravity in physics, it is not a physical thing, but a theoretical construct that helps us explain patterns of behavior and experience. The sense of a unified self, in his view, is constructed through the stories we tell, both to others and to ourselves, enabled by language. Through this narrative capacity, we come to believe in the existence of an inner self. According to Dennett, the brain constantly generates multiple, parallel representations of the world, none of which are intrinsically in or out of consciousness. Conscious experience arises not as a continuous stream, but when certain information becomes salient, in response to specific probes, be they questions, environmental stimuli, or introspective attention. Critics often argue that Dennett's theory does not solve the so-called hard problem of consciousness, but rather sidesteps it. To some, his position appears to reduce or even eliminate the phenomenon he sets out to explain, by suggesting that what we call bounded consciousness is an illusion or a mischaracterization. Nevertheless, Dennett's core contribution, linking consciousness to narrative structure and language, is especially significant for our purposes. His notion that consciousness arises as a center of narrative gravity underscores the idea that the experience of being conscious is inextricably tied to our capacity for linguistic self-description and storytelling. 4. Good old materialism, or Churchland's neurobiological reductionism. Paul Churchland, a Canadian philosopher, best known for his work in philosophy of mind, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence, approaches consciousness from the standpoint of eliminative materialism, arguing that many common-sense psychological concepts, such as beliefs, desires, and even consciousness itself, are part of an outdated folk psychology that will eventually be replaced by neuroscientific explanations. He maintains that consciousness is not a mysterious or irreducible phenomenon, but rather identical with specific, complex patterns of brain activity. Rejecting introspective or dualist accounts, Churchland insists that a true understanding of the mind must come from neuroscience, not subjective reports.
What did I tell you? Science will explain everything. We just did not know so much about neuroscience in our times.
Churchland envisions a future where mental states are described in terms of neurophysiological processes and where traditional psychological terms may be discarded. In this framework, consciousness is simply a high-level neurobiological function, fully explainable through the dynamics of the brain's neural networks. What he does emphasize is that we do not yet fully understand the precise mechanisms of how consciousness arises. Our current language and concepts, like beliefs, qualia, intentions, are probably not the right tools for explaining it. As neuroscience progresses, we will likely replace these folk psychological terms with more accurate, brain-based descriptions. This position on consciousness is particularly interesting for our purposes, as it essentially suggests that consciousness cannot be fully explained in the terms of ordinary language, an implication that brings it paradoxically close to the idea that its very essence is shaped by language itself. 5. Global workspace theory. The global workspace theory, originally proposed by the American psychologist Bernard Baars, seeks to update the traditional Cartesian theater model of consciousness, an intuitive yet scientifically outdated framework, by incorporating findings from contemporary neuroscience. The Cartesian theater metaphor imagines a theater in which a single inner observer, the conscious I, watches the unfolding of external and internal events on a mental stage. This observer interprets, reacts to, and attempts to influence these events, exerting agency by initiating bodily actions or verbal responses, metaphorically sending more actors onto the stage. This model closely resembles the popular, and problematic, notion of a homunculus, a little person in the brain responsible for conscious control. Baars' global workspace theory revises this image. Rather than positing an inner observer, it suggests that the brain is organized around a global workspace, a functional hub, in which information from various specialized, unconscious processes is temporarily made globally available. In theatrical terms, only a small region of the stage is illuminated at any given moment, the spotlight of attention, and this corresponds to the contents of working memory. Surrounding this central spotlight is a fringe of less consciously processed information, while beyond the stage lie the unconscious theatrical props, the numerous modular systems of the brain that operate automatically and in parallel. Crucially, there is no internal director observing and interpreting the scene. Rather, it is the spotlight itself, the mechanism of attention and information integration, that determines what enters consciousness and triggers further cognitive or behavioral responses. The model captures the dynamic nature of conscious access, where different inputs compete for limited representational space in the workspace, and the winning content becomes available to various subsystems, for example, language, planning, motor control. While global workspace theory aligns more closely with neuroscientific findings than earlier metaphors, it faces limitations. Notably, it does not adequately explain the phenomenological continuity of the self, the persistent sense of being a unified, bounded subject over time. Nor does it fully capture the rich, qualitative nature of first-person experience, or the deeply personal dimension of conscious life. Furthermore, global workspace theory appears to be applicable to a wide range of conscious organisms, without clearly distinguishing between the kinds of consciousness found in humans and those in other animals. Stanislas Dehaene's neuronal global workspace model can be seen as a neurobiological elaboration of Bernard Bahr's original global workspace theory. While Bahr's introduced a cognitive framework in which consciousness arises from the global availability of information to multiple unconscious systems, Dehaene sought to translate this idea into concrete neural terms. He proposed that conscious access involves a sudden ignition of activity across a network of brain regions, particularly in the prefrontal and parietal cortices, when a stimulus reaches a certain threshold of relevance. This ignition allows information to be broadcast throughout the brain, aligning with Bahr's notion of the workspace, but grounding it in experimentally testable mechanisms. Thus, Dehaene's model preserves the core insights of global workspace theory, while embedding them within a computational and neuroscientific framework. We will further incorporate some of Dehaene's technical findings into the development of our own theory of consciousness. 6. Tononi's theories of consciousness, from the dynamic core to integrated information. Giulio Tononi, neuroscientist and a leading researcher in consciousness studies, has played a pivotal role in the development of theoretical approaches to consciousness, first through his collaboration with Nobel Prize-winning neuroscientist Gerald Edelman, and later, in the independent formulation of integrated information theory. These two phases of his work, while conceptually connected, represent different explanatory strategies and theoretical ambitions. In the earlier phase, as articulated in the book titled A Universe of Consciousness, 2000, Tononi and Edelman advanced what they called the dynamic core hypothesis. Rooted in neurobiological and evolutionary principles, this framework sought to explain how consciousness emerges biologically through the integration of neural activity across anatomically and functionally diverse brain regions. The key mechanism proposed was reentrant signaling, a dense, recursive exchange of neural signals among brain areas, particularly involving the thalamocortical system. A few words should be said about it. The thalamus is a central brain structure that, roughly speaking, relays most sensory information, with the exception of olfaction, to the cortex. But it is not as if a little homunculus in the cortex makes decisions on the basis of this incoming data. Rather, the information is continuously exchanged, signals pass from the thalamus to the cortex, then back from the cortex to the thalamus, and so on. This recursive exchange is what researchers call reentrant signaling, a dynamic process in which information is constantly circulating, being updated, corrected, and modulated. Some scientists have proposed that consciousness may emerge from these recurrent loops of signaling between the thalamus and the cortex, much like the complex, self-sustaining patterns that appear on a video monitor when a camera is pointed at its own screen. Importantly, the thalamus is not only engaged in feedback with the cortex, but also with sensory systems and numerous other brain regions, which may join or withdraw from this exchange, depending on context. Together, these recursive interactions are often referred to as the thalamocortical system. According to the dynamic core hypothesis, consciousness arises when a distributed set of neuronal groups temporarily binds together through high levels of integration and differentiation. Yes, we know, this sounds complicated. But think of it like a jazz band. Each musician can play alone, but when they improvise together, highly connected, yet still distinct, you get the living experience of music itself, and that's what the brain is doing when consciousness emerges. This core is dynamic, its composition changes over time, and it supports a unified conscious scene by enabling selective integration of relevant information, while preserving the system's functional complexity. The theory emphasized neural complexity as a necessary condition for consciousness, combining high integration, the cooperation of different parts of the brain, with high differentiation, the ability to maintain functional specialization. This model was firmly grounded in biological realism, aiming to align with known neuroanatomical structures and to account for the evolutionary development of consciousness in animals and humans. However, Tononi's later development of integrated information theory represents a significant shift in both scope and methodology. Emerging around 2004 and continuing into the present, the integrated information theory adopts a more axiomatic and formal approach, departing from a purely neurobiological explanation toward a mathematical characterization of consciousness as such. At the heart of this theory is the claim that consciousness corresponds to a system's capacity to integrate information, quantified by the metric phi. Whereas the dynamic core emphasized anatomical and functional networks, the integrated information theory focuses on causal structures and intrinsic informational relationships within any system, regardless of its biological substrate. Well, we know it's tough. But it is mainly the same idea of a jazz band, where each musician can play many different notes, where notes are information. But what matters is that they're playing together, in a way that no single instrument or subgroup could replicate, which is the integration of information. The integrated information theory formalizes this intuition by quantifying the irreducible whole of the jazz performance, and claims this quantity is consciousness. Yet the theory's universality, its application to artificial systems and its implication that some non-biological systems may possess minimal consciousness, has sparked significant debate, especially regarding its apparent panpsychist leanings. Despite their differences, both the dynamic core hypothesis and integrated information theory share a central insight, that consciousness is not located in a particular region or process, but emerges from the interplay of complexity and integration within a system. 7. Quantum theory of consciousness. The quantum approach to consciousness, most notably advanced by physicist Roger Penrose and consciousness scholar Stuart Hameroff, seeks to ground conscious experience in the fundamental principles of modern physics. Their model, known as orchestrated objective reduction, posits that consciousness arises not from classical neural computation, but from quantum processes occurring within the brain's microtubules, protein structures found in neurons. According to this theory, microtubules function not merely as structural elements, as traditionally understood in biology, but as quantum computational units, capable of sustaining coherent quantum states. These states are thought to undergo objective reduction based on the geometry of space-time itself, producing discrete moments of conscious experience. The model implies that consciousness involves non-local interactions and quantum entanglement, fundamentally linking it to the fabric of the universe. The Penrose-Hameroff theory is significant in proposing that consciousness is not purely biological or computational, but fundamentally physical, requiring a revision of current models to incorporate quantum-level dynamics. Though long considered highly speculative and controversial within the scientific community, this theory has recently gained more credibility. The shift came on the 7th of October, 2025, when the Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded to John Clark, Michel Devret, and John Martinis. Their work showed that quantum effects, normally thought to exist only in atoms and tiny systems, can also appear in electrical circuits large enough to hold in your hand. However, there is still a significant distance from this discovery to confirming the quantum nature of consciousness. 8. Language and consciousness in the Chomskyan tradition. Noam Chomsky, a linguist and philosopher, is widely regarded as one of the foundational figures in modern cognitive science, having played a pivotal role in shaping its development through his theories of language and mind. The Chomskyan school of thought places language at the very center of human cognition, not merely as a tool for communication, but as a structuring principle of thought itself. While Noam Chomsky has remained cautious in extending his linguistic theories directly into a theory of consciousness, he has consistently emphasized that the faculty of language, particularly its recursive, generative structure, is deeply tied to the uniquely human capacity for inner reflection, abstraction, and narrative self-awareness. However, Chomsky stops short of claiming that consciousness is reducible to language, instead adopting a stance of skeptical naturalism, which holds that while consciousness is a natural phenomenon, it may exceed the explanatory limits of current science or cognitive modeling.
Oh, is that so? At least some of them do not pretend to be gods.
Chomsky's view has been further developed and clarified by Ray Jackendorf, a linguist and cognitive scientist closely aligned with Chomsky's generative tradition. Jackendorf argues that language plays a constitutive role in consciousness, not in generating raw experience, but in shaping the structure of conscious thought. In his model, linguistic representations interface with other cognitive systems, particularly a conceptual structure system that encodes meaning in a form accessible to consciousness. He proposes that consciousness arises at the interface between these representational systems, where linguistic and perceptual information are integrated into a coherent mental scene. Lost again? No wonder, these are complicated models. Think of it this way: every sensation or sensory modality helps create a representation of the world within us, in one form or another. These representations are not the sensory modalities themselves, but rather ways of organizing perceptions into useful schemes of reality. For example, there are auditory representational systems for music, systems that register our position in space, or visual representational systems that show to the brain what we see, in particular ways. Jackendorf argues that there are also specifically linguistic representational systems in the brain. These are not directly related to sensation, but instead connect to other representational systems, helping them to generate more effective and coherent schemes of reality. According to him, there are three main linguistic representational systems: phonological, syntactic, and conceptual. One might imagine all representational systems as separate castles in the brain. These castles are connected by bridges, and along these bridges travel knights, our thoughts, or let's better call it, information. Yet these knights are often unconscious, moving silently between castles. At any given moment, an individual becomes conscious of one particular castle, for instance, of spatial position, of the phonology of a word, or of a visual image. However, the conscious experience of any representational format is shaped by the ongoing interaction among systems. This interaction continues ceaselessly, embodied in the flow of unconscious, conscious, or half-conscious information circulating in the brain, those very knights, that animate the bridges between the castles. Importantly, Jackendorf challenges the idea that syntax alone is the engine of thought, suggesting instead that the integration of language with perception and motor systems is what enables conscious awareness of complex ideas, intentions, and inner narratives. He posits that much of our conscious life, including memory, imagination, and planning, is made possible through this linguistically mediated conceptual space. In this framework, language does not cause consciousness, but it crucially enables its structured expression and reflection. Together, Chomsky and Jackendorf offer a model in which language is not merely a reflection of pre-existing thought, but a generative scaffold for conscious experience. This view resists both reductionism and mysticism, emphasizing instead that the profound link between linguistic structure and mental architecture may be key to understanding how we come to know ourselves and the world. However, consistent with Chomsky's skeptical stance, this model also acknowledges the limits of our explanatory reach, given the still incomplete understanding of both language and consciousness. 9. Vygotsky's socio-cultural theory. Language as the origin of consciousness. Lev Vygotsky, a foundational figure in developmental psychology and cultural historical theory, proposed that language is not merely a tool of expression, but the primary medium through which consciousness itself is formed and structured. For Vygotsky, human consciousness is not an isolated, internal phenomenon, but a social and linguistic construction, emerging through interactions with others in culturally mediated contexts. Central to his theory is the idea that inner speech, a developmentally internalized form of social dialogue, constitutes the core of conscious awareness, reflection, and self-regulation. Unlike psychologist Piaget, who saw language as emerging from cognitive development, Vygotsky argued the reverse. Cognition is shaped by language, particularly through the internalization of communicative practices. In this view, consciousness is dialogical and inherently linguistic. It is not given at birth, but gradually constructed through the child's participation in shared linguistic activity. Language enables abstraction, planning, memory, and ultimately the formation of a coherent self. For Vygotsky, then, to be conscious in the human sense is to possess language not just as a means of communication, but as the medium of thought itself. 10. Damasio's embodied theory of consciousness. In his book, Descartes' Error, 1994, Antonio Damasio challenges the traditional Cartesian separation of mind and body, arguing instead that consciousness emerges from the dynamic interplay of brain, body, and environment.
That's preposterous!
Central to his theory is the idea that emotion and bodily states are foundational to conscious thought, not separate from or subordinate to it. For Damasio, consciousness is fundamentally embodied. It is the brain's mapping of the organism's own body and its interactions with the world. Damasio's theory represents one of the key foundations of our hypothesis, and we will return to it in greater detail when discussing emotions and feelings as integral components of conscious experience. With the consideration of Damasio's account, we conclude our review of the most influential theories of consciousness, having outlined the perspectives most widely recognized in the field. Many of the remaining theories represent either variations or extensions of these, while others lack a robust scientific grounding. However, none of the aforementioned theories provides a truly satisfactory understanding of what consciousness is. It is not particularly helpful to claim that consciousness is merely a combination of neural processes or an as yet undiscovered property of matter. Since our goal is to understand the specific nature of human consciousness, it is necessary to identify and analyze its fundamental components. We can then examine which of these components are shared with other animals and which appear to be uniquely human. This comparative approach may offer valuable insights into the nature and evolutionary origins of human consciousness. The following chart represents an attempt to include, as the constituent elements of consciousness, all its features currently recognized by mainstream cognitive science. Let us examine these features one by one. 1. Wakefulness. Wakefulness is sometimes considered synonymous with vigilance, but more precisely, it primarily pertains to the sleep-wake cycle. One can be in a wakeful state, while exhibiting a low level of neural activity, insufficient to trigger or ignite a conscious state. In such cases, wakefulness is not accompanied by either vigilance or consciousness. Put simply, to be conscious, one must first be awake. However, wakefulness is a necessary but not sufficient condition for consciousness to emerge. Metaphorically speaking, producing a reaction in a laboratory presupposes the prior existence of a test tube in which the requisite materials can be placed. Wakefulness functions as such a vessel, a necessary a priori condition, yet one that is, by itself, insufficient for any reaction to occur. 2. Vigilance. As neuropsychologist Stanislas Dehaene explains, vigilance refers to the level of excitation within the cortical and thalamic networks that support conscious states. When vigilance is high enough to reach the threshold for conscious access, some of the attended information eventually enters our awareness and becomes reportable to others. Vigilance functions like a flame beneath a laboratory vessel. It raises the temperature of the system, gradually increasing the activation level of the neural and cognitive processes that contribute to conscious experience. As the heat intensifies, the entire network approaches a critical threshold, a point of boiling, at which the system reorganizes itself into a fully conscious state. But if the intensity of this fire remains below a certain threshold, the system never attains the level of global excitation required for conscious integration. Likewise, if some of the systems required for the emergence of consciousness are absent from the vessel, no amount of vigilance will bring the mixture to a boil. Vigilance is therefore a necessary, but not sufficient condition for the emergence of a conscious state. According to the Cambridge Dictionary, vigilance is defined as watchfulness or readiness for danger. This aspect of heightened sensitivity and readiness is a significant feature of conscious states and should be retained in our understanding of the concept. 3. Attention. Attention is defined as the focusing of our mental resources onto a specific piece of information. Importantly, attention can operate without conscious awareness, that is, one can attend to stimuli unconsciously. For example, we may drive a car along a familiar route while remaining largely unaware of our actions, yet still maintain full attention to the surrounding environment and traffic conditions. This distinction highlights that attention and consciousness, while closely related, are not synonymous. 4. Emotion. Much has been written about the role of emotions in rational decision-making and their influence on human cognition. The terms emotion and feeling are often used interchangeably, or only one of them, typically emotion, is used to cover both. In this discussion, we adopt the distinction proposed by neuropsychologist Antonio Damasio. According to Damasio, emotion originates as a set of subcortical neuronal signals that represent the current state of the body. These signals trigger involuntary and automatic dispositional responses from cortical regions, aimed at restoring or maintaining the organism's functional balance. As a result, a corresponding emotional body state emerges. Tough again. Don't worry. We will now explain emotion in more detail, and it will become clearer. To put it simply, emotion arises when our body reacts to a perceived stimulus in response to the effect that this stimulus exerts on our physical well-being. An emotion is fundamentally a blueprint for a specific bodily state, arising as an automatic reaction to a given stimulus or a combination of stimuli. All living organisms constantly interact with their environment, and this capacity for reactivity began with the most basic reflexes. For instance, when a doctor strikes your knee with a reflex hammer and your leg kicks forward, this response occurs automatically, seemingly independent of conscious will. Emotion, in a sense, is like such a reflex, only more complex. Rather than being triggered by a single, direct stimulus, emotions typically result from complex streams of information, gathered through multiple senses. These inputs are processed by distinct neurological circuits, and the nervous system integrates them to formulate an appropriate response. This process requires negotiation and coordination across multiple systems. As with a reflex, the emergence of emotion is not governed by conscious will, yet it forms an integral part of our conscious perception of reality.
Honestly, I do not decide to be afraid.
It happens all by itself.
With this, nature acts economically. Rather than computing a new response from scratch each time a familiar stimulus appears, organisms evolve ready-made emotional responses, pre-configured bodily states that can be quickly activated when certain stimuli are encountered.
Hey, we've seen a leopard before. How to take out the fear emotion from pigeonhole number 23 and implement it.
In this way, both animals and humans possess a kind of neurological library of such standard responses. These may be seen as predefined programs, encoded by the evolution to efficiently manage recurring situations. In animals, whose lives tend to follow more regimented patterns, the repertoire of such emotional responses is relatively limited. Given our interest in the relationship between language and consciousness, it is instructive to examine the role that communicative vocalizations play in animal behavior. Notably, such vocalizations are embedded within and regulated by the animal's emotional responses to environmental stimuli. When an animal encounters a specific stimulus, a certain vocalization is triggered as part of its emotional program. Take, for instance, a seagull that produces a loud, distinctive sound upon spotting food. This vocalization is not a voluntary decision, it is an automatic component of the corresponding emotional state. The bird cannot help but make the sound, it is part of the organism's off-the-shelf response to a common ecological challenge. Animals generally do not require a wide array of such responses. For example, a chimpanzee has a repertoire of only about 30 distinct vocalizations, a relatively small set acquired over millions of years of evolutionary development. If a new stimulus becomes both frequent and significant for survival, organisms can, over time, develop new dispositional representations, initially through learning, and later through epigenetic changes, that eventually lead to heritable behaviors. However, such adaptation is rare and slow. For the most part, animals retain a limited yet effective set of emotional responses that serve their needs. In this view, it has been said that emotion is the animal's reason, a fast system of reaction and adaptation, developed in the course of the evolution, that substitutes for deliberative cognition in many species. We must also introduce the term intentionality, which will be employed in Part 2 of this lecture. It is a complex and nuanced concept in philosophy of consciousness that demands careful explanation. An emotional state is inherently charged with intentionality. It is important to distinguish intentionality from intention. While an intention typically refers to a specific, conscious aim or decision to act, intentionality is more fundamental. It can be compared to the soil and climate, in which intentions grow, rather than the intentions themselves. That is, intentionality creates the preconditions, the field of potentiality, within which certain intentions and actions can arise. It shapes and constrains the possible ways an organism might respond to a stimulus, based on the physiological and emotional state induced by that stimulus. For example, the emotion of fear, as an effective mode of intentionality, discloses a world of threats and escape routes. Fear arises within the intentionality which is about the organism's overall experiencing of danger, and the attitude towards it, and shapes how the organism apprehends and relates to a dangerous stimulus. In fear, the horizon of possible actions narrows, not by conscious choice, but through the body's inherent orientation toward what threatens it. The organism's potential behavioral responses get reduced to a small set of reactions shaped by evolution: fight, flight, hide, or freeze. These responses are not chosen consciously, rather, they emerge as likely outcomes within the intentional structure created by fear. Thus, intentionality, understood as the general cognitive orientation toward a stimulus, initiates a progressive narrowing of the range of possible emotional responses that this stimulus can evoke. Within the selected emotional domain, a further selection occurs. One specific physical reaction is chosen from the available range, corresponding to that emotion. This constitutes a gradual fine-tuning of the body state, culminating in a concrete physical response to the stimulus. Hence, the entire chain of our interaction with reality, external to the mind, can be conceived as a sequence of progressively narrowing vortices: intentionality, emotion, intention, action. It is important to emphasize that our model assumes a radically embodied and non-volitional reinterpretation of intentionality, in contrast to traditions that ascribe to it a phenomenological or transcendental nature, such as in the philosophies of Edmund Husserl and Jean-Paul Sartre. For us, intentionality is not an act of conscious freedom or a function of the transcendental ego. Rather, it is the body's first, broad, and pre-reflective attunement to the stimulus, an initial evaluation of what the stimulus signifies for the organism's well-being and survival. This pre-reflective orientation is shaped by the organism's memory, context, and state. It encompasses the set of potential intentions and behaviors that are primed or made likely by that state. In this sense, intentionality is about the stimulus. It orchestrates the organism's embodied reaction to it, and shapes the meaning of that stimulus through a full-spectrum, physiological response. Moreover, intentionality is not static. As organisms learn and adapt to new stimuli, the emotional responses, and thus the associated intentional structures, can evolve. Intentionality, then, is not only about reacting to stimuli, but also about integrating new information into the organism's repertoire of responses, gradually refining the emotional landscape over time. Intentionality always involves perceiving the world not exactly as it is, but as it ought to be, according to what is right or fitting for me. When I perceive something and describe it through my emotional state, I implicitly include in that description a sense of how the object should change, in order to better align with my needs or desires. Multiple systems contribute to determining which intentionality, and thus which emotional range and subsequent specific reaction, will arise from contact with a stimulus. Memory plays a key role, for instance, through stored conditioned responses, as do processes such as object categorization, and the integration of objects into larger cognitive schemas. Thus, when I see a leopard that is far away, asleep, or unusually small, I will not experience a strong emotion of fear, and will therefore behave differently than I would if the leopard were large, awake, and nearby. The decision regarding my emotional and behavioral response, however, is made unconsciously by an automatic switchboard in the brain. This concludes the present section on emotions as part of the conscious state. We have devoted considerable attention to this topic because, as noted in our previous lectures, the synchronization of emotions played a central role in the emergence of human language. We maintain that language is the principal driver in the emergence of the specifically human form of consciousness. Therefore, the emotional mechanism constitutes the key physiological feature to be analyzed in order to understand it. Although emotions are part of the conscious state, they themselves remain unconscious. When an emotion is perceived by us, however, it transforms into something else, it becomes a feeling. A feeling necessarily entails a conscious state, and it is the feeling that constitutes the next component of consciousness we shall address. 5. Feeling. Feeling happens when an emotional bodily state itself gets perceived by the brain. When emotions are linked to cortical areas involved in higher order processing, such as those responsible for learning and reasoning about the environment, they are transformed into feelings. Yes, Dennett again. Well, what Damasio means is that a feeling is a new round of perceiving the object as now being partly the external object and partly the bodily state it evokes. The feeling, however, is not an emotion on a new level, but a higher level representation of the emotional relation between the body and the object. He further posits that a feeling depends on the juxtaposition of an image of the body proper to an image of something else, such as the visual image of a face or the auditory image of a melody. In this passage, Damasio suggests that feelings can also be higher-order representations, formed when the brain integrates a particular emotional state with the mental image of a different object through an association based on the similarity of the emotional states that the two objects elicit. A stimulus such as music can therefore evoke a bodily state similar to those produced by other experiences. When such bodily configurations overlap, the corresponding feelings also overlap, so that one feeling may come to represent or stand in for another. Thus, for example, the sound of sad music may evoke the feeling associated with numerous past experiences of loss or sorrow. Damasio's account of this interaction bears a striking resemblance to the process of assigning symbols to reference in language. We may also discern here the roots of human imagination. Nevertheless, science still lacks a clear explanation for why an emotion becomes consciously perceived as a feeling, rather than simply developing into a more complex emotional state. Our theory will address this issue. Feeling in this interpretation, contrary to claims made in some academic works that do not clearly distinguish between feeling and emotion, is regarded as an exclusive feature of human consciousness. Animals, under this view, do not possess feelings, though they experience emotions. 6. Memory. It is well established that memory exists in multiple forms: semantic, motor, episodic, and others. Memory is not localized in a single anatomical region of the brain, but is distributed across various dispositional patterns, which are accessed opportunistically by conscious states. Different types of memory vary in their proximity to the neural centers that process incoming data. Broadly, we distinguish between long-term memory and immediate, or working memory, the latter functioning as a limited capacity buffer where signals arriving at early sensory cortices are temporarily held. The primary limitation of this buffer is its small capacity; it fills up quickly. Consequently, incoming signals must either be discarded, resulting in information being forgotten or never consciously registered, or transferred to long-term memory, thereby freeing up space in the buffer. Many people intuitively associate their conscious self with memory, particularly working memory. This association is understandable, as working memory is closely linked to conscious access. It is where attended information is temporarily held and manipulated during ongoing experience. However, long-term memory also plays a critical role in shaping our interpretation of incoming information. It modulates and customizes our mental representations of the present moment, aligning them with our current biological and social motivations. Neuroscientist Gerald Edelman described the experience of the present as a remembered present, a scene that adaptively links immediate or imagined contingencies to an integrated mental scene. It is also important to emphasize that animals possess memory, and that memory contributes significantly to the formation of their mental representations of the world. 7. Thought. Thought can be understood as a neuronal pathway, or a combination of pathways, through which a sensation is transformed into a reaction. However, this transformation follows a route far more complex than that of a simple reflex, or an emotional response. Thought arises from the interaction between sensory data and various types of memory, the individual's capacity for categorization, systems responsible for learning, and where present, the ability to attribute mental states to others, i.e., theory of mind. At its core, thought involves generating a new emotional or bodily response to a stimulus or phenomenon for which no pre-existing, standardized reaction is available. It thus functions as a fundamental component of the individual's learning mechanism within the environment. There is general scientific consensus that many animals, particularly primates, possess rudimentary forms of thought. Even species such as pigeons have demonstrated the ability to recognize abstract categories. Importantly, much of thought is processed unconsciously. 8. Reason. Reason typically refers to the capacity for logical thought, inference, and deliberate problem solving. It involves making judgments, drawing conclusions, and following established principles of logic. Its scope is centered on abstract and structured thinking, and it is closely associated with what is commonly referred to as rationality. The ability to manipulate abstract concepts, anticipate developments in the environment, and solve novel problems is a core function of reason. It allows individuals to transcend immediate sensory input and engage in reflective, goal-directed cognition. But we have already established that the task of solving novel problems is carried out by thought. Does this imply an overlap between thought and reason? We propose that the relationship between reason and thought is analogous to the relationship between feeling and emotion, that is, a relationship between a higher order and a lower order mental state, both of which share a similar nature. Reason in this model is the result of the brain observing thought. In this view, the higher order state, reason, functions as a reflection of the lower order one, thought. The higher order state becomes intentional not with respect to the external environment directly, but with respect to the internal mental state itself. A higher order mental state thus observes a lower order one, treating it as its internal object or stimulus. As a result, in contrast to a single instance of thought, reason constructs a hierarchy of thoughts. Decision-making involves navigating through multiple layers of thought that together constitute the process of reasoning. It entails generating new thoughts from initial ones, forming a cascade of increasingly complex representations. In this sense, a thought can be likened to selecting an answer to a multiple-choice question, solving a problem at a single level, whereas reason resembles solving a multi-step equation that spans several levels. Reason enables us to move up and down this hierarchy of previously processed thoughts, to revisit and re-evaluate answers, and to select as many responses as needed to address the initial question. Furthermore, reason allows us to synthesize new questions from the selected answers, thereby generating higher-order multiple-choice problems that further refine our understanding and guide future thought. This operation must necessarily proceed in sequence, that is, syntagmatically. Our working memory lacks the capacity to hold multiple complex thoughts simultaneously. As Dehaene notes, we are fundamentally reduced to one thought at a time. Each new step in the reasoning process introduces a novel and uncertain stimulus for the perceiver. By increasing the complexity of internal representations, and thereby delaying immediate reaction, reasoning becomes a risky cognitive investment. This inherent risk keeps the brain in a heightened state of alertness. As a result, the neural circuits underlying conscious processing remain consistently activated above the threshold required for conscious access. Thus, we can only reason consciously. Edelman and Tononi refer to the inevitable serial succession of conscious states, highlighting the linear, stepwise nature of conscious reasoning. In contrast, a simple thought that leads directly to a reaction, often processed unconsciously, is also present in animals. Reasoning, however, belongs to a uniquely human cognitive repertoire, involving deliberate, multi-step manipulation of abstract representations. That said, rudimentary forms of reasoning can be observed in animals and, as experiments with primates demonstrate, may be developed in them to a certain extent. The famous bonobo kanzi demonstrated nearly 90% accuracy in responding to novel, pragmatically anomalous, yet syntactically correct instructions, involving the manipulation of food, objects, or tools. For example, he understood the command, "Put the soap on the apple." Similarly, the chimpanzee Wo show exhibited rudimentary semantic combinatoriality, producing expressions such as water bird to refer to a swan and candy fruit to indicate a watermelon. Reason, therefore, should be understood as part of the animal biological system, not in the sense that animals possess it innately, but in the sense that through rigorous human-led training, certain primitive forms of reasoning can be developed in some animals. This suggests that there is nothing inherently metaphysical or even materially special about the capacity for reason. As Damasio aptly puts it, the expression neurobiology of rationality is particularly pertinent. Reason is supported by the integrated state of the brain, which produces consciousness and incorporates emotions and feelings, the neural machinery for biological regulation, whose core is constituted by homeostatic control, drives, and instincts. That said, while biology in principle allows for the emergence of reason in animals, it appears that evolution placed a dead-end sign at this turn for all species except humans. So why did thoughts in humans begin to think thoughts, thereby giving rise to reason? Why did emotions become emotional about themselves, thus generating feelings? What is the nature of this higher-order quality that developed in the human brain? We may be tempted by a solution proposed by Antonio Damasio. Among primate species, those that feed primarily on leaves have smaller neocortices than those that feed on fruit, since a fruit-based diet requires greater perceptual discrimination. As a result, fruit-eating primates required more elaborately organized cognition, and their neuronal pathways became increasingly complex. But Damasio's argument may explain why simple reflexes evolved linearly into more complex emotions, and why many animals are capable of basic forms of thought. But the development of feelings and reason cannot be explained by such an account. We return to the survival risks introduced by symbolic cognition. Metaphorically speaking, symbolic behavior appears as an accidental side effect akin to a car skidding on a wet road after accelerating too quickly. Animals, in contrast, seem to be cautious drivers. In the entire history of language experiments with primates, not a single animal has ever combined more than 3 signs into a new conceptual unit. Even chimpanzee Washoe's often cited achievement is disputed. Some critics argue that what he intended by water bird was not a novel concept, i.e., swan, but simply a combination of 2 separate referents, water and bird. Anticipating some of the answers that will be elaborated in part 2 of this lecture, we argue that reason did not emerge in humans primarily from a need to process increasingly complex thoughts. Rather, it arose with the development of neuronal mirror architecture in the brain. Once these internal self-referential mechanisms evolved, humans could not avoid reflecting upon their own thoughts, thereby generating reason through processing their thoughts by these recursive, mirror neuronal loops.
Doctor, I I feel as if these images in my head keep mirroring each other and keep dragging me into the darkness. I need to talk them out.
9. Intelligence. In our chart, we have listed intelligence as a separate component of consciousness, although this is not entirely accurate. Reasoning can be understood as a core component of intelligence, particularly in contexts that require conscious, abstract problem solving. In this sense, reason is part of intelligence. However, while reason and intelligence are closely related, they are not strictly synonymous. Reason typically refers to the capacity for logical inference and the manipulation of abstract concepts, whereas intelligence encompasses a broader range of abilities, including learning, adaptation, pattern recognition, and the ability to anticipate developments in the environment. And so, intelligence is a broader term than reason, although both refer to the capacity to acquire and apply knowledge, adapt to new situations, solve problems, and learn from experience. Intelligence includes logical reasoning, but also encompasses emotional intelligence, creativity, spatial reasoning, memory, and learning speed. For instance, in Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, intelligence is divided into distinct modalities, such as linguistic, spatial, and interpersonal, not limited to abstract reasoning alone. Intelligence is generally more adaptive and often involves non-conscious processing, whereas reason is typically conscious, deliberate, and rule-based. Reasoning can be seen as a core component of intelligence, particularly in contexts that demand conscious, abstract problem solving. We included intelligence as a separate box in our chart to highlight the distinction between a broader cognitive capacity, one shared by many animals, and a narrower capacity within it, namely reason, which appears to be unique to humans. 10. Language. Thinkers from antiquity to the present day have agreed that language is a cornerstone of humaneness. Yet theories about how language participates in perception, thought, and consciousness vary widely. Typically, human consciousness is regarded as not strictly dependent on language. Evidence for this includes conscious states observed in infants and individuals with aphasia. While it is widely accepted that language enhances or boosts cognitive processing, consciousness itself is often considered as a distinct phenomenon. We do not agree with this moderate position, which assigns to language merely the role of a cognitive enhancer, a kind of auxiliary booster of human consciousness. In part 2 of this lecture, we shall argue that language constitutes the very foundation and central mechanism that make human consciousness possible. It both predates and conditions the emergence of consciousness in humans. In response to the previously cited arguments, we contend that the consciousness of infants has not yet attained the developmental stage of fully human consciousness and remains, in this sense, on an animal level, one that, as we have previously argued, does not preclude a certain degree of intelligence. As for various aphasic pathologies, the consciousness of such patients has already been formed through language, therefore it is not accurate to say that they possess consciousness, but lack language. Rather, their consciousness, originally constituted by language, has suffered a disruption in its primary structural component, and this rupture affects their conscious experience to varying degrees. The intuitive connection between consciousness and symbolic thinking in the form of language remains paradoxically unclear. Psychologist and linguist Ray Jackendorf has approached this issue from the linguistic side, proposing a system of conceptualist semantics and conceptual structures. From a neurophysiological perspective, Antonio Damasio's notions of qualified and qualifier in the construction of multi-layered representational states offer another attempt to bridge the gap. Neuroscientists Edelman and Tononi, for their part, observe that representation implies symbolic activity, an activity that is certainly at the center of our semantic and syntactic language skills. We have also previously referred to neurobiologist Edmund Rolls, whose higher-order syntactic thought theory of consciousness posits that higher-order thought is necessarily organized linguistically. Nonetheless, the precise mechanism by which language participates in, or possibly even gives rise to conscious states, remains largely unexplained. In part 2 of this lecture, we will attempt to offer some answers within the framework of our own theory. 11. Self-awareness. The adjective self-aware is often used synonymously with humanly conscious. Yet many animals, despite their often dismissive label as the unawares, demonstrate a limited degree of conscious self-recognition. Gordon Gallup's classic mirror self-recognition test has been successfully passed by chimpanzees, orangutans, dolphins, elephants, magpies, and even pigeons. Self-awareness in animals appears to be linked to the activity of neuronal networks involved in proprioception and kinesthetics. These circuits enable the organism to perceive the position of its limbs relative to one another, monitor bodily movement, and maintain orientation in space. This is where conscious self-awareness begins, but in non-human animals, it typically does not develop far beyond this sensorimotor foundation. Despite some semantic ambiguity in how the term is used, self-awareness in animals is largely unconscious and limited to bodily self-monitoring, rather than extending to reflective or symbolic awareness, as seen in humans. 12. Metacognition. Metacognition is the ability to reflect on one's own mind, on one's thinking processes, and on oneself as an external entity, a self. A distinctive feature of conscious experience is this parallel awareness, often described as watching oneself doing something while simultaneously doing it. We will anticipate our central thesis again, and propose that this quality in humans arises directly from the faculty of speech. Rather than evoking the metaphor of an inner observer, it is more accurate to describe metacognition as the effect of an externalized voice, someone outside the self, defining the self through language. We will explain this phenomenon in detail later. Some philosophers and scientists have argued that metacognition is the hallmark of uniquely human consciousness, even though it can be observed to varying degrees in other species. Indeed, metacognition is not entirely absent in animals, as there is compelling evidence that some species, such as dolphins, are capable of knowing that they do not know something. But just as reason remains undeveloped in animals, as if it were a forbidden path in evolution, metacognition too exists in animals at best, in only the most rudimentary form. Metacognition should be seen as another higher-order mental state, alongside feeling and reason, marked by what might be called higher-order intentionality. Metacognition's lower-order counterpart lies in the brain states responsible for proprioception and kinesthetic processing, which, as discussed earlier, underpin the form of unconscious self-awareness present in animals. However, to perceive oneself metacognitively is not merely to monitor one's body. It is to perceive and recalibrate one's internal mental states by imagining oneself as a physical body external to the mind, a linguistic body, brought into being through speech. 13. Qualia. Qualia are phenomenal conscious states, or, was referred to by some proponents of higher-order theories of consciousness, recognitional judgments of experience. Qualia represent what it feels like to experience something, for instance, the redness of an apple in Frank Jackson's famous thought experiment, or the subjective experience of what it is like to be a bat, in Thomas Nagel's well-known essay. Qualia are free-floating, they may be triggered by multiple stimuli simultaneously, including sensory input, random memories, or spontaneous thoughts. For many, qualia serve as an undeniable marker of a unique self, seen as the very core of human conscious experience. Taken further, they are sometimes interpreted as the non-physical essence of the self, or even as a token of human metaphysical freedom. It is easier to understand qualia as our self, internally generating a unique subjective awareness from each encounter with reality, and, through this awareness, affirming its own presence within us. Traditionally, this presence has been referred to as the soul. Alternatively, qualia have been understood as epiphenomenal, an emergent property of the brain's neuronal dynamics, what Edelman and Tononi describe as forms of multidimensional discrimination carried out by a complex brain. Philosophical theories of consciousness often devote significant attention to qualia, treating them as either central to, or deeply problematic, for any adequate account of conscious experience. The British philosopher and cognitive scientist Peter Carruthers has developed his own distinctive account of how consciousness should be understood. His theory is called dual content theory. Essentially, what Carruthers states is that mental states which exist in animals in the form of phenomenal, or in other terms analog consciousness, becomes human due to some quality that makes them interact with themselves and generate a more complex intentionality, possibly an intentionality imbued with theory of mind. We once again encounter a recurring motif in our analysis. The human constituents of consciousness are essentially the same as those found in animal consciousness, yet, for some reason, they began to form closed circuits upon themselves. It is still not clear, however, from Carruthers, what this reason is. We will attempt to explain it in our theoretical model. This concludes our review of the foundational components of consciousness.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please resume your seats, we have a bit more to discuss before the end of the session.
What observations can we draw? First of all, note that animals also possess conscious states, although these differ from those of humans. It is readily apparent that wakefulness, vigilance, attention, emotion, memory, thought, intelligence, and self-awareness occur in many animal species. However, animals appear to lack the specifically human faculties of refined affective feeling, abstract reasoning, complex language, metacognition, and rich qualitative experience, or qualia. A useful way to frame this distinction is to note that human affective feeling builds upon and regulates the more basic emotional responses present in animals. Human reasoning elaborates and systematizes the cognitive processes that in animals manifest as non-abstract thought, and metacognition extends the capacity for self-awareness into reflective monitoring and control of one's own mental states. Language and qualia, however, appear to occupy a special and perhaps unique role within the architecture of human consciousness, language potentially enabling forms of conceptualization and subjective richness not available to other species. In the second part of this lecture, we will attempt to clarify the core mechanisms of human consciousness and proceed to formulate a theory of consciousness grounded in our central hypothesis, the premises of which were outlined in earlier lectures. Meanwhile, let us briefly summarize the main conclusions that can be drawn from today's review. 1. Understanding human consciousness remains a complex challenge for scientists. While philosophical models of consciousness abound, often differing widely in their theoretical foundations, the empirical investigation into the material, anatomical, and neurological mechanisms that support consciousness is still in its early stages. In neuroscience, this search is commonly framed in terms of the neural correlates of consciousness, NCC, a term referring to the minimal set of neural events and mechanisms sufficient for a specific conscious percept or experience. 2. It is already evident that the brain does not contain a single, centralized decision-making center. Even well-defined functions, such as memory, have a distributed character, with different components of these functions localized in various regions of the brain. 3. There remains considerable vagueness and conceptual overlap in how specific functions and features of consciousness are named and categorized. Nevertheless, it is increasingly clear that some functions play supportive roles, while others form the core of conscious processing. It is also evident that many mechanisms of consciousness operate unconsciously, that many of these mechanisms are shared with non-human animals, and that, for reasons not yet fully understood, certain mechanisms in humans appear to be split into two systems, one responsible for processing perceptions, and the other for processing the process of perception itself. This division gives rise to the distinction between lower-order and higher-order mental states. 4. Language appears to play an important role in human conscious states, yet this role remains poorly understood in contemporary science, with only tentative and largely speculative theories currently available. 5. Qualia are among the least understood and most poorly explained phenomena in the study of human consciousness. Nevertheless, their existence is evident from the immediacy of first-person conscious experience. We thank you for your attention and look forward to welcoming you again in the second part of our lecture on consciousness. In the following section, we will provide a list of scholarly references that supported the preparation of today's lecture.